API Conference, Elevating API Literacy.
Good afternoon. I'm Fawaz Haroun. I'm a software engineer, and today I'm just going to be demoing API performance monitoring with Grafana and Prometheus. Monitoring is about visibility. If you build a system, when something goes wrong, you want to be able to see what's going on in that system, right? If someone, for example, you share an API with them and they test it, they are getting an error. You test it on your end, you are getting a success. It's sometimes difficult to replicate what they see. So this is where monitoring comes in. With monitoring, you can simply just take a look at your systems and know what exactly is going on. You can know the exact status of your systems. So despite the fact that your requests are fine, you can know what your users, the experience your users are actually having. And so this is basically what Grafana and Prometheus helps with. So Grafana and Prometheus are open source tools that basically you can host on your own and use without, of course you pay for your hosting, but you are not paying for licensing the software. Otherwise, you can also host with Grafana and Prometheus. So they are great options because they are easy to use, they are cheap, especially when you consider other options. For example, Datadog. Datadog bills can get really, really expensive. On the other hand, Grafana, like besides your hosting cost, it's relatively cheap. So I don't have slides because I want us to just demo it so you see how it works. And the goal for today is just to show you a little bit of how Grafana and Prometheus work together, and so you can go further and explore it on your own. So treat this as a starting point. There are 4 types of metrics in Prometheus: counters, gauges, histograms, and summaries. And for the purpose of this talk, we will be going over counters and gauges. They are relatively straightforward. Counters do exactly what the names imply. They count. So for example, if the counter is on 0, if I have a pending transactions counter on 0, when I increment it, I can increment it by any number I want. So by 1, for example. When I check on that counter, it's on 1. Gauges, on the other hand, they increment and decrement. So you can either increment it or decrement it. So you use counters in the context of when you want to keep track of. For example, you want to keep track of how many pending transactions you have. And you also want to keep track of how many successful transactions you have. You can track both you can have both a pending transactions counter and the successful transactions counter. And then you can now do whatever you want with this data. For example, you could calculate success rates. If you are tracking, if you pass certain labels, you can also minimize it down to maybe currencies. You can take a look at how long these transactions are taking to happen. While gauges, on the other hand, mean you don't necessarily care about what the values are. You just want to make sure that this thing is not too high. For example, if maybe you implemented a queue yourself, you want to take a look at what's going on that queue. You want to make sure that there aren't too many items just in that queue not being processed and it's not just increasing. You might want to use a counter so that when when something is added, you increment your counter. When something is processed, you decrement the counter. And so that way you can just make sure that, okay, for example, if 500 items is your safe number, you want to make sure that you can just open a dashboard and take a look. Do I have more than 500 items? And so that's the idea of what we are trying to do today. There are 3 parts of this. The exporter, which is usually in your code base or your system, which basically exports metrics that Prometheus can read. The Prometheus server, which basically scrapes these metrics from your server. And then Grafana, which you use to create a dashboard from these metrics. So I think I can just get started with the code. I already have Prometheus and Grafana installed, but if you want to install them, you could just use Brew for Mac. For Windows, you can check the website. You can just Google Grafana install Windows or Prometheus install Windows, and you'll see the website. But yeah, for Mac, you can use, yeah, you can install with Brew. I have, but I'm just going to run it again. It's literally just Brew install Prometheus. You guys can see the screen, right? Okay, yeah. Is it better? Is it better? So brew install Prometheus, like it didn't really do anything because I already have it installed, as I said. And then for Grafana, it's the same thing. Oh, yeah, thanks for that. Brew install Grafana. To start and stop the services, I'm just going to so I want to start Prometheus. It's already started, but if you haven't started it, it's going to start on it's going to start on port 990, and we could just take a look at that. So this is my port 1990, and this is Prometheus. And on its own, Prometheus is not it's hard to interpret, right? You can check your configuration. So these are mine. And you can see that I basically have, currently my targets are localhost 1990, and that's because by default, Prometheus scripts metrics from itself. And then I also have one on 8080. Is it better? So can you see what I have highlighted at the bottom of the screen? Yeah. You can see it, right? Okay, let's do that. Is it better? All right, so by default, Prometheus scripts itself, that's localhost 1990. And then I also added port 8080. If I wanted to add a new port, from my terminal, I would find my configuration file, and that's usually in Brew. So I go into the options folder. I can see on Brew. For Windows, you can just like check online for where you can find the configuration file for Prometheus. So if I list these files, I can see okay, so in these files, I can see the Prometheus.yaml file, this one. We can all see it, right? So that's the file we need to edit. So I'm just going to open it. And this is it. So by doing this, I can add any other thing I want scripts. So for this, I'm just going to change this to, let's say 8,000. Because I'm going to start my server on port 8,000. So I want Prometheus to just script directly from my server, which will be running on port 8,000. And then after I do this, for the change to take effect, I have to restart Prometheus just so that change takes effect. So I'm just going to run a restart command. Yeah, and if I were to go back to Arc, which is my browser, I check configurations. I could also check this in service discovery. For some reason, it's not coming up at the moment, but configuration. So we can see that this has changed to 8,000, right? So that is Prometheus is configured to script my metrics. And if I were to open that file again, you will just see some other things. This script interval is basically saying how often should Prometheus check for new metrics. And I'm saying every 15 seconds. So every 15 seconds, just go into all my servers that are configured here, and then script the metrics that are available. So in the server file, I'm just going to set up a simple Express server. For now, I have I've installed Prom clients, which in JavaScript in NodeJS, that's the recommended Prometheus library to emit metrics. So I've installed Prom clients, and I also have Express just running. So I'm just going to set up an Express server, I'm writing code with one hand, so pardon my speed. So I want to set my ports to 8,000 because if we remember, Prometheus is scraping from 8,000, right? Yeah. And because I want to add other things to my request, I want to use the request body in Express. I'm just going to be adding this middleware that basically makes sure that I can access the request body in Express. Then my server itself, get. Also, just to confirm, we can all see the screen clearly, right? The code, okay. So first, before we get started with emitting metrics, I just want to confirm that all of this code I've written to basically run a server is working properly. So let me listen on ports, which is 8,000, which I set above, and then the callback function, which you just log. Yeah. So I just want to log running when my server starts. So I can start it now. So running. So it should be running on port 8,000. I go to my postman. Is it clear? Like, is it visible to everyone? Is my postman visible to everyone? Yes. So I'm changing. So the URL should be 8,000. And if I send that in, we can just see the hello world. So my server is up. So next up, I just want to add. So next, I would just like to add a few metrics, just so we can see what these metrics look like. I mean, before we send them to Prometheus, we ourselves want to see what it looks like. So I would add let's add a transaction pending metric. But before that, I want to import Prometheus. I want to import Prometheus client, which is different from Prometheus. Prometheus is the server that scrapes from my app, while Prometheus client is how I export these metrics from my app. So yeah, require from client. I'm setting up a register here, and this is because you can set up different registers in Prometheus in your Prom client. Each register holds a record of metrics. So for example, if you wanted to have metrics with the same name, but in different registers, you could theoretically do that if you wanted. But for my case, I only really need one register because I'm not really doing anything super complex. So yeah, I'm going to just new clients.registry. So with my registry, I'm going to set up a Prometheus counter. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned that a Prometheus counter, all it does is count, like literally just counts. I make a transaction, it counts based on what I set. So yeah, I'm going to set up a pending transactions counter. Let's call the variable pending counter. So it's a new. I'm still setting it up from the Prometheus client. So a new counter. When we set up counters, we have to add the name of the counter because the name is basically how we identify that this is the name of this metric. This is the pending transaction. So we need the name for that. So I'm going to just call it pending transactions. We could optionally add a description, which is called help, which basically like gives some insight into what exactly this metric is keeping track of. So I'm going to just call it pending transactions, because I mean, ideally, that's what we want to keep track of. And then we could add label names. So label names are basically how we, even when you have pending transactions, the pending transactions can be different across different groups. For example, this transaction could be a Naira transaction. This one could be a dollar transaction. That's something you ideally want to keep track of. Because if, for instance, there was a problem with just your dollar transactions, but your Naira transactions were fine, and most of your transactions are in Naira, you would potentially not notice this. So you ideally want to keep it in a separate group, just so you can check in specifically on it to see how it's performing. So for my label names, I'm just going to say, for now, I just want to keep track of currency. So after creating the counter, we created a register at this point, and we just want to register the counter in our register, just so when we call on that register to check the counter, it's available. And we do that by just calling the register and then calling the register metric function on it, and then we just put the pending counter. So now I have this, and I'm going to set up another endpoint. This is a metrics endpoint, and what this just does is to export my metrics for me. So I just want to take a look at, before it gets to Prometheus, I want to take a look at the metrics I have. So I'm going to await this because it's an asynchronous call, and then I'm just going to call the register.metrics function. I have to mark this as async. Yeah, and then I just return the metrics. So I could restart this. If I were to go, let me move this since I'm not using it as often. If I were to go back to my metrics endpoint, just change this to 8,000, and I were to call this. This is essentially what it looks like. So we can see here that this counter is here, but because there is no value, currently it is 0, so it is not present. So if we wanted to increment that counter, so we want to say every time we call this endpoint, this pending endpoint, we want to increment this counter, right? And we want to, we want to increment this counter. So I'm going to be calling the pending counter, which we created earlier at this point. And I could just do inc, which by default increments it by 1. And then I'm just going to return a response saying pending counter increased. So I could go back to Postman, come here and then check here. And now when I check on my pending counter, okay, there is an error. Okay, I made it a get endpoint. So let me just make it a post endpoint, because eventually I do want to send some data. So that's why I'm making it a post endpoint. So if I just try this again, so I get the response pending counter increase. And if I come to my metrics, I click on fetch metrics. We can see that it's incremented by 1, right? We can all see that, right? So if I were to just, let me click this a few more times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it should be 6, hopefully, if I counted it right. So yeah, that's 6. So if I were to go to Grafana now, Grafana runs on localhost 3000. I'm just confirming that that's like clear to everyone. So on Grafana, let me restart my Grafana just so we see what it looks like when you first start it. So I've restarted it, and I'm just going to refresh this page. I'm not quite. Actually, let me stop it and then start it. And that's because there's essentially a login step, which, although the username and password by default are just admin, it gives you the option to change it just for security purposes. On your local host, it's not something you really need to do, except you have some secure, maybe you've kept some Prometheus links that are secured there, then you probably want to consider changing it. So that even if someone gets access to your laptop, they can't just start accessing metrics that are ideally supposed to be private. So I've restarted it, and I refreshed the page again. For some reason, it seems like it's not logging me out, but yeah. So for the data sources, I'm just going to add a new data source. Grafana can take quite a number of data sources actually, but what we want to use today is Prometheus. I'm sorry, I can't see that. Okay. So with Prometheus, we just localhost 1990, because we mentioned earlier Prometheus runs on localhost 1990. So I'm just going to paste that here. And I'm going to save and test. So you can see that it's successfully queried the Prometheus API. So it has saved it, and then I can come here, and then I can create a dashboard. So I'm just going to check here. By default, it would ask you to use a builder, which helps you can just select your metric, pending transactions, and then when you run the query, it just shows you your transactions that Prometheus has scraped. So I could also, this is currently like this because I used the same name. So I was earlier just testing stuff out, and then I used the same metrics names. So Grafana, so Prometheus basically registered it as the same. So if you are scraping from different servers, you also have to be careful that you're not using the same names across those different servers, or it could cause a clash. But you'll notice that it just keeps going in a straight line. So if I were to add even more pending metrics, usually takes 15 seconds, but we can just keep running it until we see it. Okay, so we can actually let me bring down the time to 15 minutes. This is actually what we are doing now. This blue one is for the metrics we are currently on. So I actually do think it's unique across different instances, so you can use the same metric names. So it's in a straight line. So what this tells us is that it keeps increasing, which can sometimes be difficult to track. So ideally, I might want to know what is the rate of increase. For example, I want to know that at 2 p.m. today, I had 5,000 transactions. At 3 p.m., I had 1,000 transactions at a glance. And so we just use, here I've switched to code, and we just use the increase command. So there is something called PromQL, which is basically a query language for Prometheus. And when I use this, it's, okay, that I have to add a time. So I'm just saying over the range of 5 minutes. So segment it into blocks of 5 minutes. And then when I go ahead to run the query, So we can now see that it just shows us like the time change over time, right? Considering time, I would like to round up. And just before I do that, I just want to like show us what labels look like. So for this pending metric, I could say, let's add labels. So I'll just say add labels, and I'm just going to say take it from the body, request.body.currency. So I want to add those labels and then increment the counter. I'm going to restart my server, and then we are just going to see, let me make some extra calls. So I'm just going to send a few more just so we have two different labels. So when I go back to Grafana, I can come in here if I run my query again. So I can see all these extra calls. I could also decide, you know what, I want to segment it by the labels. So I want to see it by labels. So I'm just going to come here and do this. So I'm going to sum by, and then I'm going to put the name of the label, which in this case is currency. And I'll run the query. So this yellow dot here, it seems like it hasn't really propagated. But ideally, there will be two lines.
Like 2 minutes.
All right, sure. Yeah, ideally, there will be two lines, and with this query, just one showing the Naira values and one showing the dollar values. You could also emit, the same way I've done pending, you could do successful, you could create a successful counter and then just track that, and then also write a query using the successful transactions. And then you could also do arithmetic operations, just doing, for example, successful transactions divided by pending transactions over 100%. That will tell you the number of your transactions that were initiated pending that eventually become successful. And most of this also works with counters. Except that with counters, most of this also works with gauges, except that gauges, while we only
API Conference, Elevating API Literacy.